right, we've been talking about this. We're probably going to continue to talk about it because it's very problematic. Right? As I've mentioned multiple times, during my stint on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, one of the last hearings as chairman that I conducted was looking at the rise of anti-Semitism in Western Europe. Now, our role was only looking internationally. We couldn't look at what was happening here in the United States, although you clearly see what was happening on college campuses. But what we've seen in the last month, I mean, this is explosive. And as Congressman McCormick and others have talked about even today, this has to be addressed. The warning bells should be going off because the attacks on people of Jewish faith and descent, the ethnic Jewish people, is an early warning sign of increased hostility to Orthodox biblical faith. And don't think it's going to stop here. Historically, it hasn't, and it won't. We need to stand up and call this out. We need to defend not just the nation of Israel, but the Jewish people. This anti-Semitic rhetoric and these threats of violence, I mean, they've skyrocketed in the United States since Hamas attacked Israeli civilians 1 month ago today. On college campuses, such chatter has been mainstay, joining a toxic stew of anti-Christian, anti-American ideology from the left. But according to a recent report from the Network Contagion Research Institute, this rhetoric is more than merely an organic outgrowth from leftist professors and administrators. Instead, it suggests that foreign donors have showered campus leftists with cash. The report finds that more than 200 American colleges and universities did not disclose more than $13 billion in contributions from foreign regimes, most of them authoritarian. Join me now to discuss this is Meg Kilgannon, Senior Fellow for Education Studies here at the Family Research Council. She served in the Department of Education during the Trump administration. Meg, welcome back to Washington Watch. Always great to see you.
It's great to see you.
Alarming. This report just out, I think it came out yesterday, that we're seeing over $13 billion going to these institutions of higher learning that they didn't report. Why? Why would you not? Number one, they're supposed to report this requirement to see where this influence is coming from, but they didn't. Why?
Well, you'd have to ask them, but it's either because they forgot or because they're ashamed of it or because maybe they're doing some research that perhaps is not, something that we would like to see it from our institutions of higher learning.
So let me just jump right into this. The number one country funneling undocumented funds to college campuses in the United States, Qatar.
Yes.
Just so happens to be the home of many of Hamas's leaders who are not living in Gaza. They're calling the shots from elsewhere, but Qatar is one of the countries.
Right. It's very interesting where the money is coming from. And
Qatar is also the country that we're doing the transaction, not we, the Biden administration is doing the transaction with Iran on the frozen assets.
Right. So is that an oversight or is that a deliberate omission? You know, have they just simply forgotten to mention that they got $1.3 billion from foreign donors?
I mean,
that's a lot of money to forget to mention.
And I've done a fair amount in the Middle East on different things, and I've just never seen Qatar as a country that was really interested in higher education in the United States.
Well, I mean, you're dealing with a university system in the United States that has completely been absorbed by moral relativism, right? They're certainly mostly anti-Israel, and they're definitely a lot of them are anti-American. So the fact that they're taking this money and they're not disclosing it, it's evidence that they consider themselves above the law, or they just don't care to be held accountable for what they're doing. We did a report on this during the last year of the Trump administration. Reed Rubenstein was our general counsel, and he did a lot of the oversight in this regard. And Senator Ron Johnson was one who was asking a lot of questions about this too, and during the Trump administration, because we finally had people at the Department of Education who were going to look into this and ask questions. So we released a big report about this in June of 2020, and there's a webinar. The report is still on the U.S. Department of Education website. There's a webinar there that explains exactly what we were looking at and why. And at that time, we were very interested in the money that was coming from China and going to research schools that were colluding with Wuhan and doing gain-of-function research that had been, taken offline in the Obama administration and then put back online by Fauci through a sleight of hand.
Well, China's number 3 on the list of undocumented sources. Saudi Arabia being right after them. I mean, this this should be troubling.
And this whole stream of funding got underway during the original. You remember back when the Democrats didn't like war, and when we were doing the after 9/11, those things,
Right.
they were all anti-war then, and so you had universities and colleges struggling to find purchase, to looking for Islamophobia everywhere they could find it, right? Looking for it everywhere. And so a lot of this funding was happening through programs where they were trying to educate Americans about, how Islam is a religion of peace and we should all just get along and all of that. So that's kind of the history of some of this. And over time, you see over the years, that was 20 years ago. Here we are now, and they've got a lot of money streaming through those channels and organizations that they set up on campuses.
I want to go back to something you said a moment ago about the moral relativism and the anti-American viewpoint that we've seen on college campuses. So it's kind of like there's been this moral vacuum created, and there's no moral neutral ground. I mean, when it comes to morality and it comes to truth, you're going to have a stand. There's no such thing as being morally neutral.
Right.
And so they pursued this. They kicked American exceptionalism off of college campuses. God had long been expelled. So should we be any surprised that it's been filled with this? I'm just going to say, from a standpoint of just looking at it, inexplicable hatred for Israel and the Jewish people.
Well, you can slaughter civilians in Israel, Hamas can, right? And then that has to be somehow put in the context of the fact that Israel is an oppressor or colonizing nation or something, right? Somehow we have to allow that slaughter to take place. And then the only kinds of activities we're going to condemn are just war in response to that Israel, now we're asking for these pauses and things, that not allowing Israel to defend themselves against terrorism.
Right. So there are those who are justifying Hamas's actions, saying that these were oppressors, and so resistance. I mean, this is some of the language that even members of Congress have used. We were just talking about Rashida Tlaib. Resistance. Well, let me just put it in the context of American criminal justice. If you have someone breaking in your house, you shoot them, protect yourself, that's one thing. But if you shoot them 45 times and you dismember them, that's not protecting your home. Right.
And, the ideas that support this kind of moral relativism are fruits of the critical theories that have gone into our universities, that have been the project of
This
Marxism,
is fertile ground for this.
This idea that a colonizer is the oppressor, that automatically puts you into the oppressor-oppressed dynamic, right? And so the people who are the colonizers are always the bad guys, and the people fighting against them are always the good guys. And so here we are. They consider Israel to be a colonizer. I disagree with that.
Is this an anomaly, or is this a candid picture of what higher learning looks like in America today in these Ivy League institutions?
Well, I think that in the Ivy League institutions in particular, they really do seem to have gone off the rails. I mean, the activist groups on those campuses, the fact that you have a hard time expressing any kind of Jewish faith on those campuses, but I'm sure that if someone were attacked for wearing Muslim religious garb, that would be considered appalling by people on the campus. But harassing...
Which is the same thing with, when it comes to speech, everybody has speech except Christians.
Right.
So and this is where I think we have to realize the spiritual alignment between Christians and Jews. Now, I understand they're two different elements. So I don't want people emailing me telling me about theology, but the reality is we come from the same faith. There would not be Christians if there were not Jews.
Right.
And so there's that shared hatred for them because they declare there is truth and we can know that truth.
Right.
And that's why I think if we don't defend Jews and stand up to this anti-Semitism that we see spreading across this country like wildfire, it's going to be inflaming and engulfing evangelicals and other people of faith, Catholics, Protestants of every denomination.
Sure. I was, as a Catholic, sad to see some of the Catholic universities on the list who had not made the disclosures. I mean, it's one thing if it's an oversight, and it's another thing if it's deliberate collusion with a government that is known to be hostile to the United States, and if you do disclose it, you're going to be asked questions about it, so they don't. Now, we can't know from this report who is in that category, but we do know that the disclosures weren't made. Right.
I mean, you would think if you are an institution of higher learning, you would know something about accounting. And reporting.
Report filing, right?
I mean, you're supposed to be teaching your students to do these things. You would think that they can. Now, there's going to be, or that you should, there's going to be a hearing on this topic actually tomorrow here on Capitol Hill.
Yes, tomorrow on the House Judiciary Committee is holding a hearing at 10 a.m., and we'll, of course, be watching that. And there were Senator Rickett and Senator Rubio sent a letter with some other senators asking Secretary Mayorkas to look at the visa status of students on campus who had participated in the Hamas Day of Rage, because you could make the argument that they were supporting a foreign terrorist organization when they did that. So if you're here on a student visa and you're supporting a terrorist organization, that's grounds to have your student visa revoked and for you to be deported. And so they asked for them to do that review. I don't think it's been done, but I appreciate them asking about it, because these are the kinds of ways that we can hold people accountable.
Going back to this hearing tomorrow on the free speech on college campuses, in looking at this report that was just released that we're talking about, that we've been talking about, is there a correlation or a connection between those campuses that received this foreign money, where we saw a 250% higher incident of anti-Jewish activity, but is there also a connection with suppressing free speech?
There seems to be. Correlation is not always causation, but this seems to relate. I mean, that's what they say in the report, that these you can't prove that there's a connection, but you also can't prove that there's not, right? It makes sense that there would be a connection.
Well,
if you are incentivized by money to host these organizations, then yeah, you're going to have some nonsense on your campus. And let's not forget the great report that Chris Kasich did on the left-wing anti-Semitism that was taking place on college campuses. He did that report in 2018. Right. That report is still good to this day. And the sources that he cited in that report are sources that they rely on in this new report. And they work well together in putting this issue into good context.
Well, it's very evident that we have a problem. That is clear. Why we should all be concerned is that these institutions of higher learning, whether we like it or not, are producing the leaders of this country for tomorrow. Now, I know it's They're leaders coming from other institutions, but
And we're all being asked to pay for the student
Right.
loans of people that are going to these super expensive colleges. They're not just, they're elite colleges, and they're very expensive. So I don't want to forgive the loans of the kids that are up to this
Right.
nonsense. It's not fair to anybody.
well, I go back to our motto around here: pray, vote, stand.